Hi everyone, and welcome to today's quick fix. We're talking all about rounded objects, how to draw a rounded object on a flat page. Well, we're going to use a flower pot as our example today. So I've got a baseline here, a straight line across the page, and I'm going to show you first. If I was drawing a flower pot, I would start off with two sort of tapering in sides like that. But this is where the choice comes. So I'm going to draw a second one so we can look at the two opposite each other. Okay. So I guess if you were drawing something really flat and cartoonish, you'd keep the top and bottom line flat like that. And it's quite clearly a sort of very cartoonish drawn vessel, but it's certainly not anything remotely lifelike. However, if you instead of a straight line go for a curve and then a mirrored curve on the top, but also, oh, it's a bit of a wobbly one, a bit of a wonky one, also continue that sort of curved shape there, you're getting a more 3D rounded shape. So we can do away with this now. So the other thing is how we paint it, how that's going to help us. So if I take some colours that sort of remind me of terracotta pots, well, the first thing is that I'm looking at more than one colour. I'm looking at more than just an orange, say. Either side of it I've got yellow ochre, and I've also got cadmium red. I've also got many other colours in my palette which we'll get to, but if we were just doing our flat one here, single colour all the way across, coloured in. I think this is actually quite a good moment to mention also that watercolour painting is really not, especially with me anyway, just about colouring something in. Colour is there to create all sorts of clues for the beholder to work out what is actually being depicted on the page. Okay, so the amazing thing about watercolour is even when you're trying to paint in something as flat as possible, as single coloured as possible, because we use water, there's every chance that you might get tiny bits of light and shade. So okay, it's all right, but what if we were to add in a little bit of extra colour? Now I'm going to do it on the flat one because I want to give it a chance. So firstly, sort of just by adding in just a little bit of yellow ochre in sort of dappled kind of manner, that's sort of helping. Maybe actually bringing in some colour from the sides underneath as well whilst it's still wet. This all sort of is starting to look a little bit more interesting, but it's still looking pretty flat. Whereas if we already have our rounded shape, we can approach this and really help enhance its rounded shape rather than starting with something completely flat and trying to build it up. So what I would do is I'd start with my main colour, my orange, and I would paint in a sort of decent bit of colour on either side. So that's quite a wet colour there. It's not that dilute, there's quite a lot of colour going on there. And then I clean off my brush. And then what I'm going to do with that clean wet brush is I'm going to draw in the colour from either side, along the bottom as well. And just sort of by cleaning off the brush each time and just sort of dabbing it, because terracotta also has a sort of kind of dappled tone. So that's a really good start. But then also I can take the other colours and sort of collect it in various areas that I want. But if I'm just trying to concentrate it more on the sides and the bottom then it means that there'll still be some texture in the middle, but largely this pot will be working nicely. And then my red colour, it was a bit too strong there, I was going in too hard, but if I mix it in with my other tones, then I can get a lovely sort of much more sympathetic roundness. Maybe a little bit more at the bottom. And also we're going to see sort of what's in the pot at the back. What I like to do is wait for this to dry before placing that in, so you get two distinctive sections that are not bleeding into one another. Now, the other key thing of helping with the roundness of a shape is shadow. So up here I've got burnt sienna and Paynes Grey mixed together to create a lovely grey shadow mix. Now, firstly, I can drop in a bit onto my actual pot, so that's still wet. I could just drop in a little bit on the edges, but also there might be one side that's got a bit more shadow than the other, so maybe I drop in a bit more on this side, and I can also add some shadow to the ground, so it's actually casting a shadow there. Whereas this one here, again, because of the way we drew it in the first place and the painting style, it's going to look much more cartoonish if we add the shadow in. It's still okay, but it's not as obviously rounded as that one there. Now this is dry, we would be painting in the back here, but of course also there's the question of what's in it. So if it's a flower pot, we might have some soil. We're not going to see that there. And then we might have a few plants. This one here, the plants will be sort of coming out in a more sort of flat way, whereas you can have things sort of coming from further forward in the pot, further back in the pot. So all these things are things to consider. This isn't to say this isn't like a bad way of painting, it's just a different way. So you would probably end up painting things in more of a, I'll use a slightly bigger brush, more of a sort of flat linear manner, not sort of overlapping with each other quite so much. Whereas here, what we want to do is just consider maybe there's a little bit of soil. So it might take a little bit more time, but it's going to reward you much more richly if you're looking for a nice rounded shape. You can see how I'm using light and shade with this soil as well, just dabbing in the brush and leaving some bits of unpainted space there, and then painting in the plants on top. So on this side we've got a nice flat, everything sort of at the same distance from the viewer, all the plants just sort of jigsawed in, nothing overlapping. Whereas this one here, what I've done is I've painted in two sprigs that are sort of further up the back of the pot, and you'll notice that these leaves are a little bit more dilute, because what I can do now is I can paint in some leaves over the top in a more concentrated green. And this is just another way of really helping you create a 3D piece. You've just got to make sure that your layers are dry before you paint on top of one another. The other thing I've done is I've painted a leaf sprig that is sort of bent over the front of the pot. So again, this is done in some more concentrated colour. Now of course the back area of the pot has not yet been painted in, and I would say it's kind of up to you sort of the order in which you want to do these last little bits. I've sort of thought, well, I'll get these leaves painted in and see what's left, to be honest, because what I didn't want to do is be layering up tons and tons of layers of watercolour on top of each other with all these leaves, because of course watercolour is a translucent medium. If you really enjoy being able to layer up sort of colours, all sorts of colours on top of one another, and don't want to be limited to just choosing a darker colour each time, then painting in gouache would probably suit you really well. It's a more opaque watercolour basically, and it's great fun to use, but it is a whole different approach. Okay, so one last wait to dry, and then we'll get the last bit of the back side of the pot painted in. So the last little bit, let's get those colours back in again. Don't want too much, just get a nice little brush and just go carefully round, trying not to disturb the colours in the front. And there we are. That is your quick fix for today.